She counted 6 trees that were already dead before she'd been in the orchard a full 10 minutes. The man who owned them didn't know that yet. He was still standing at the fence, waiting to hear whether the woman he'd brought home on a $50 promise was going to turn around and ask for the next stage back to town. My name's Josephine Ainsley, 26 years old that spring, though I felt closer to 40 most mornings. I'd grown up outside a river town in Ohio, in an orchard my father built with his own 2 hands, and by the time this story starts, I'd been living out of a single trunk in a boarding house in Millhaven, Wyoming Territory, for the better part of a year, mending other people's shirts for other people's wages. This is the story of the letter that got me out of that room, and the man and the land that came with it, and how close I came to walking away from both before I understood what I was actually looking at. The letter came on a Thursday, early April, folded twice, sealed with a plain wax I didn't recognize. No return address worth mentioning, no flourish to the handwriting. I read it standing at the window of the boarding house, glass cold against my shoulder. The street below loud with wagon wheels, and the smell of mud that passed for spring in that part of the territory. It wasn't a long letter. A man out in Cutter's Bend, 60-some miles east, past where the rail line thinned out, was looking for a woman willing to enter into what he called a practical arrangement. 40 acres, apple and pear, a farmhouse that needed managing, and a boy of 7 who needed the same. He was careful, almost stiff about it, to say this wasn't a search for romance. He wanted competence, room, board, a wage, and if both parties found the thing workable after 30 days, they'd make it official at the courthouse in town. I read it twice. Folded it back along its own creases, set it on the sill. I'd come to Millhaven after my father died with $40, a sewing basket, and no particular reason to be anywhere else instead of here. The boarding house work wasn't unkind. The woman who ran it was fair to me. But my room faced a brick wall, and somewhere over 11 months, I'd started noticing that I was disappearing a little at a time. The way a person does when nobody's asked her a real question in a long while. The letter didn't promise anything fine. It promised labor and a roof and an honest accounting of what it was. That felt like enough to risk. I wrote back the next morning, and I want you to remember I was thinking about apples when I did it. Not about him, not yet. If you've ever taken a leap because the alternative was slowly vanishing, you already understand why I got on that train. Stay with me, because what waited at the end of that ride wasn't what either of us expected. And neither one of us saw the second letter coming, the one buried in a ledger neither of us had opened in years. Cutter's Bend turned out to be smaller than the name suggested. The depot was 2 planks laid over packed dirt, nothing more. And the town arranged itself along a single street maybe 200 yards long before the buildings gave out into open country. A general store with a bell over the door, a livery. A church that needed paint worse than anything else in town, a saloon with a sign hanging by one nail. Past the last building, the road ran flat and curved east, and past that curve I could just make out, in the thin gray light, the start of something. Long rows of budded branches running back from the road, toward a low gray farmhouse set against a hill. I stood on the platform with my trunk and watched the train pull away, and for a second I let myself feel exactly how far from Ohio I actually was. A man was crossing the street toward me. Tall, unhurried, hands loose at his sides, wearing a coat that had clearly worked through more than one winter. He stopped a few feet short and looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to read honestly, no performance in it either direction. I met his eyes and didn't fill the silence, a habit my father used to say would either serve me well or get me labeled difficult, depending on the company. "The stage runs twice a week," he said finally, "if you find this isn't what you expected." "Show me the orchard," I told him. That was Thomas Bellamy. He walked ahead of me by half a step the whole way out of town, not leading exactly, more the way a man walks when he's stopped thinking about the ground because he's walked it 10,000 times. Neither of us talked. The morning air still had last night's cold pressed into it. The orchard came up on the left before I expected it, the rows closer together than I'd pictured from the platform, and longer. 40 trees, maybe closer to 50. Apple mostly, though I could tell that from the shape of the budding before a single leaf had opened. tight clusters at the branch tips just starting to loosen. The grass between the rows had wintered over flat and pale, and a stretch of fence along the road had lost a post and leaned outward at the joint like a man favoring a bad hip. I stopped at the fence line. He stopped beside me and looked at what I was looking at. I asked him how many years it had been since a good harvest. He was quiet a second too long. 4, he said. Then quieter, some would say 5. I didn't ask him what the difference was between those two numbers. I was already looking at the nearest tree, at a low branch running almost parallel to the ground, and at the beginning of a bud cluster that had dried out and gone black before it ever had the chance to open. Fire blight, I said. I know, he said. Do you know how far it spread? Not exactly. I set my trunk down against the one fence post still standing and walked into the first row without asking permission. The grass was wet through my boots. I worked down the row slow, checking branches at arm's height, then lower, stopping at the second tree, turning a branch over in my hand, moving to the third. He waited at the fence and watched me do it. When I came back, I told him straight, 6 trees were past saving. The rest had the blight at the margins, tips, a few interior branches. But if we cut it back hard before the leaves came in full, it wouldn't reach the heartwood this season. He said he hadn't known you could stop it like that. You can't stop it, I told him. You can only stay ahead of it. He was quiet again, and then he asked how I knew what I knew. I told him my father had grown apples back in Ohio, that he'd been a careful man, and that I'd watched him work more seasons than I could count on 2 hands. I didn't tell him my father was dead. I didn't tell him that watching him prune those trees had been the whole of my practical education, or that I thought about him nearly every day since the funeral, or that there'd been nothing left in Ohio worth going back for. I just picked my trunk back up off the ground. He opened the gate. Here's where I want to pause and tell you something, because it matters for everything that comes after. Neither of us shook hands that morning. We didn't sit down at a table and negotiate terms like 2 people closing a business deal, though that's technically what we were doing. We just started working. And I've come to believe that's the truest kind of introduction. 2 people can have a watching how somebody handles a saw when nobody's grading them on it. We worked the first tree together that same afternoon. He had a handsaw and a pair of loppers that badly needed sharpening, and I told him the loppers came first, before anything else got touched. He found a whetstone in the barn and stood there watching me draw it along the blade in long, even strokes, not fast. Patient in the particular way that comes from having done a thing so many times that hurrying never even occurs to you as an option. The cuts had to be clean, I told him without looking up from the stone. A ragged cut is an open door. He understood, I think, that I wasn't only talking about the blight. We started at the crown of the worst tree. I showed him the angle just past the collar, not flush, not too far out, and made the first cut myself so he'd have something to measure his own against. The branch came down clean. I carried it to the far side of the fence, well clear of the orchard, and set it down. Burn it, I said. Not near the trees. He nodded and made the next cut himself. I watched his hands, not his face, and when the branch fell, I carried it to the pile without telling him whether it was right or wrong. He'd know soon enough. We moved to the next branch. There's a rhythm that shows up in this kind of work after a while, and by the 4th tree it had found us both. He'd learned the angle. He'd learned not to reach past what the blade could take in one clean draw. I stopped checking his cuts and started working ahead of him instead, marking branches with strips of cloth from my pocket so he'd know which ones and in what order. By dusk, his shirt was soaked through at the shoulders, and I had a small cut across my palm from a stub of branch I'd grabbed without thinking. I wrapped it in a strip torn off the hem of my second apron and didn't make anything of it. He noticed. He didn't say anything either. We carried the last of the cut wood to the burn pile as the light went flat and cool, and he went for the matches while I stood at the fence and watched the fire catch. Small, controlled, a thin gray column climbing into still air. I watched it until I was sure it wasn't going to spread anywhere it shouldn't. He came and stood a few feet off, and neither one of us said a word while the smoke thinned out over the darkening rows. If you've ever worked a long, hard, wordless afternoon alongside someone, and come out the other side of it feeling like you know something true about them that talking never would have gotten you, stay with me. because that feeling was only the beginning of what this orchard was about to teach both of us. There's a ledger buried in that farmhouse that neither one of us has opened yet, and what's written in it is going to change how Thomas sees his whole life. But that's still 2 days off. First, supper. I'd put a pot on before we left for the orchard that morning, and by the time we came back in from the fence, the kitchen smelled more of the meal than of smoke. He washed up at the basin by the door. I set 2 bowls on the table without asking if he was hungry. A man who spends a full day pruning trees is hungry. That much I already knew about people. We ate mostly in silence, though it wasn't the same silence as the ride out that morning. That first silence had been 2 strangers being careful. This one had a different weight, the tiredness of 2 people who'd worked a long stretch together and had nothing left to prove to each other over it. He refilled his bowl without asking. I noticed and didn't remark on it. The wind had come up outside, moving through the trees we just pruned, and it sounded different than before, less crowded, more room in it now that we'd opened the canopy. He turned his hand over on the table at one point and looked at his own palm. A blister was rising at the base of his first finger from the pruning saw. He'd felt it an hour back and said nothing about it, the way men in that country tended not to mention small hurts. I saw it the way I see most things, without appearing to look directly. I got up, went to the shelf near the window, came back with a small tin, and set it beside his bowl without a word of explanation. Beeswax mixed with something darker, my mother's old recipe, though I didn't say that part either. He looked at the tin, then at me. I'd already sat back down and gone on eating. He opened it, used it, and didn't thank me, because somehow the quiet in that kitchen had already said it for him. I was up before him the next morning. He heard me moving in the kitchen and lay a minute in the gray light listening, the stove door, the iron settling on its feet. By the time he was dressed and standing in the doorway, I had coffee going and was at the window looking out at the orchard. From where he stood, he could see what I was seeing. The pruned trees in that early light, cleaner now, each branch given room to breathe. The row nearest the barn, which had been choked with crossing wood for 2 seasons, now showed sky between its branches. I had my arms crossed over my chest, not against the cold, but the way a person stands when they're quietly pleased and have no interest in performing that feeling for anyone else in the room. He crossed to the stove and poured himself a cup. I didn't move from the window right away. When I finally turned, we stood on opposite sides of that kitchen with our coffee going cold, and neither of us said a single word, and it was, strange as it sounds, one of the more companionable mornings I'd had in a year. We didn't waste it. I pulled my coat off the peg and went straight back out, and he didn't ask where. He could already tell by the direction I'd been looking. Toward the far end of the orchard, the block he'd let go 2 seasons running because, in his words later, he'd stopped seeing the point of fighting it. 6 trees, maybe 7, crowded in so tight the canopy had become one solid gray mat, no light reaching the lower wood. Bark gone dark and rough on 2 of them in a way that told me the inside wasn't much better. He came through the gate and stood beside me without a word. "Some of these are pretty far gone," he said finally. "The ones on the outside aren't," I told him. And they weren't, the crowding had pressed them hard, but they still had color in the wood, some give under a thumb on the smaller branches. I walked the row touching as I went, pressing, bending, reading the angle of new growth the same direct way I did everything. He hung back and let me work. "These 4 can come back," I said after a while. "And the other 2. I put my hand flat against the trunk of the worst of the failing trees and held it there, like the bark might have something to tell me if I waited long enough. "The other 2 come out clean," I finally said, "so the rot doesn't spread through the roots." He said he'd get the saw that afternoon. I said I'd mark which branches to save on the 4 we were keeping. That's how the whole morning went. I marked with torn cloth, pale against the dark bark, and by the 3rd tree he understood the logic behind it, not just cutting away what was dead. But reading the shape a tree was straining toward and clearing the path there. I could feel something shift in him as he watched. He'd spent 2 years seeing everything wrong with this orchard. I think that morning was the first time he started seeing what it was still reaching for. We worked through the cold without much talk. I marked, he noted. A few times he handed me a strip of cloth before I even reached for one, and I took it without looking up. By mid-morning, we'd cleared 2 full rows, and I stood at the end of them with my hands at my sides, looking back at what we'd done, pale strips moving in the small wind, marking every branch I'd chosen to keep. "The cloth won't hold in a hard wind," I told him. "I'll have wire on them before the week's out," he said. The 3rd row was worse, and I think he'd known it would be, had been avoiding thinking about it straight through the fall. 3 trees there had splits down the main trunk where water had gotten in and frozen, and cracked the bark wide open. I ran my fingers along the first split for longer than I needed to. "This one's done," I said, and moved on without ceremony. He stood by that tree a moment longer than the others. I found out much later he'd planted it himself the spring after his wife died, though he didn't say a word about that then. He just noted whatever he was noting privately and followed me down the row. The 2nd tree in that row I spent real time on. I circled it fully, looked up into the branches, crouched at the base where the roots broke the soil, put my palm flat against the trunk, and held it there the way I had with the other one. "This one we save," I said. "You're sure? The rot's shallow, hasn't reached the wood yet." I paused. "We'll have to cut it back hard, though. It'll look ruined for a season." "All right," he said. I studied him a beat longer, checking whether he meant it. "I've been looking at ruin for 2 years," he said. "One more season won't change much." Something moved across his face just then, not quite a smile, more like something quietly settling into place. I tied 3 strips on that tree, more than any other in the orchard, and kept walking. We ate at noon sitting on the fence rail, bread and dried meat I'd wrapped that morning. The cold had sharpened enough that our breath showed. I ate steady, looking out over the rows we hadn't reached yet, and I was counting the remaining trees without quite meaning to. "How many do you figure we lose?" he asked. "4, I said. "Maybe 5 if the winter runs hard. And the rest come back." I said it plainly because by then it already felt like fact rather than hope. We finished the last row as the light was failing. I walked it once more after we were done, moving slow between the trees, checking my cloth strips, touching the bark of each tagged tree with 2 fingers the way you'd check a forehead for fever. Brief, practiced. A gesture I'd learned from my father without ever noticing. I'd learned it until that moment. He was watching from the fence when I finally straightened up. Neither of us said much on the walk back to the house. The cold had dropped another degree, frost already crackling in the low places where the grass held moisture. I carried my satchel. He carried the leftover cloth strips, rolled and tucked under one arm. At the door I stopped and looked back at the orchard one more time, and he stopped beside me. The tagged trees stood pale in the last light at the near end of the first row. 4, 5, 6 of them, standing a little apart from the rest the way sick things always seem to. Though I knew even then, that was more my own mind doing the sorting than anything the trees themselves were doing. "The cutting will need to happen before the ground freezes hard," I said. "How long have we got?" 2 weeks, 3 if the weather holds," he nodded. "I'll get a sharp saw from town." "Not the one in the barn." I went inside. He stayed out a minute longer, looking at those strips of pale cloth in the dimming light, 4 or 5 I'd told him earlier. He counted the strips himself, standing there, and came up with 6. He filed that away without saying anything to me about it and came in a few minutes later. I'd already started the fire by then. The stove ticked and popped as it warmed. I was unpacking the satchel at the table, setting out the last of the cloth and twine when I said, without looking up, "The one at the end of the 3rd row." "The one with the split bark," he said. "Yes, it's older than the others, older root system. If it comes back, it'll come back stronger than anything else out there. And if it doesn't," I set my hands flat on the table and looked at them a second. "Then we learned something about what the soil's like at the end of that row." That was the kind of thing I said sometimes, a plain observation that somehow carried more weight than it announced. He'd already learned in just 2 days not to push past sentences like that. They were finished when I finished saying them. He went awash up. I lifted the lid on the pot I'd started that morning, smelled it, put the lid back. 20 minutes, I said. We ate by the window while a light mist fell outside, the lamp throwing a warm yellow circle on the table between us. I'd made a stew from the last of the dried venison and whatever root vegetables were left in the cellar. He ate without comment, which by then I understood was his particular way of saying it was good. Comment came when something was off. Silence meant approval. Once I looked out toward the orchard, though the mist had gone too thick to see past the nearest trees. He noticed where my eyes went. He didn't say anything about that either. After supper, he settled into the chair near the stove with a harness strap I'd set aside for him, a buckle that had started to separate at the seam. I hadn't asked him to leave it there for me to notice. It was simply there, the way small needs get communicated between two people who have stopped requiring formal requests of each other. I washed the bowls in water that had gone cold and didn't complain about it. Wrung out the rag, draped it over the basin's edge, stood there a moment with my hands at my sides while the stove popped behind me. "I want to check the rootstock records," I said. "The ones from when the orchard was first planted. Ledgers on the shelf behind the seed tins," he said. I crossed to the shelf and ran my fingers along 3 worn spines, ink faded almost to nothing on each one. I pulled the oldest, carried it to the table, opened it under the lamp. The handwriting inside wasn't his smaller letters, more careful, leaning slightly left. Whoever had kept it with real precision. I turned pages slow. Each entry dated, each tree logged by year, rootstock variety, a soil note for the season. I found the 3rd row, found the last entry logged there. The date read back 18 years. The rootstock variety was noted in 2 words I didn't recognize, an older naming convention from before the hybrid work that had come through in later decades. Below it in smaller script, difficult ground, clay shelf at depth, planted late, give it time, I read that twice. My finger traced the line like I was trying to press it into memory. "Who kept this ledger?" I asked, quiet, a pause behind me. "Back then, yes, my father." I closed the ledger carefully, set it flat on the table, spine aligned with the edge the way it had sat on the shelf, his father. He'd never once mentioned a father in the months since I'd arrived, not in any of the evenings we'd sat at this same table. I'd assumed, without ever quite deciding to, that he'd come to this land alone, built the house alone. Planted the orchard alone the way some men do, when they arrive somewhere with enough stubbornness to make solitude mean something. I looked up at him. He hadn't moved from near the door. The harness sat forgotten at his feet. The lamp between us threw half his face into shadow, and what I could read there wasn't grief exactly. It was something older than grief. Something that had been sitting quietly with him long enough to lose its sharpest edges. "He planted the 3rd row," I said, not a question, I'd already read as much. "Most of it," Thomas said. "I finished the last 4 trees the spring after he died." I was 19. I kept my hands flat on the ledger's cover. Outside, the wind had picked back up, moving through the upper branches with that dry, late-season sound. "The note at the bottom," I said, "give it time." "He wrote that about everything hard in his life," Thomas said. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the ledger, then back at him. He'd bent down to pick the harness back up, turning it over in his hands the way a man does when he doesn't know where else to put himself. "He was right about the clay shelf," I said. "I know. It's why the trees in that row took longer to establish. The roots had to go sideways before they could go down, find their own way around the obstruction. But once they did, they anchored differently than the rest of the orchard. Deeper hold, less stress in a dry year." He went very still. I watched his hands slow on the harness, watched him look down at the floor for a moment. And I understood, the way you understand things you can't quite explain how you know, that I'd just said something he'd needed to hear for far longer than the 2 days I'd been on his land. He set the harness over the back of a chair, looked at me, then at the ledger. "There are 11 more of those," he said. "I know. I counted them on the shelf." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, didn't reach for a ledger of his own. Just sat inside the lamp's circle with me, while outside the wind worked at the corner of the barn, not hard, just present, the way cold reminds you it hasn't left. I turned the page I'd been on and set my thumb against a column of figures. He wasn't looking at the page. He was looking at the middle distance between the table and the window, the way a person looks when they're finally letting themselves think about something they'd put off thinking about for years. I didn't try to pull him back from it. After a while, he reached over and drew the 2nd ledger toward himself and opened it. The year after the original planting, the year a late frost in April took a 3rd of the blooms. The losses were listed in a tight, careful hand. His father's I'd gathered by then from how the slant of the writing changed in later entries. He set a finger on one line and read it without speaking. I watched him only a moment, then went back to my own page. This was the part I hadn't expected, how easy it turned out to be, sitting in a room with a man, when neither of us required anything from the other beyond exactly this. I'd spent time in enough rooms where silence pressed in and asked questions and kept a kind of score against you. This wasn't that. This was two people working at the same problem from opposite ends of a table, with a lamp between us doing its quiet job. "The bloom count in year 3 is wrong," I said. He looked up. "I compared it against the harvest weight," I told him. "The numbers don't reconcile. Either the count ran low or the yield estimate was generous." He looked at the page in my ledger, then at his own. "My father counted by walking the rows himself," he said. "He may have missed the back section. That would account for it." I wrote a small notation in the margin, light enough in pencil to be undone if I turned out wrong. He watched me do it without speaking. Then, "You don't have to fix what he got wrong." "I'm not fixing it," I said. "I'm trying to understand what actually happened." "There's a difference." He set his hand flat on the open page. I turned to the next column. Outside, the wind came again at the corner of the barn, and one of the horses shifted its weight in the stall, a low settling sound through the wall. The lamp didn't waver. Its circle held steady over both our ledgers as I moved my thumb down to the next row of figures. We worked through it that way, until the lamp burned low enough that I had to tilt the page toward the flame to read the smaller numbers. He noticed before I said anything and got up for the second lamp, lighting it off the first without asking, setting it at my left where the shadow had been falling. I didn't thank him. I moved the first lamp back, so both circles overlapped across the page. We'd reached the entries from 3 years before the blight, fuller numbers there, more confident in their sweep. His father's hand pressed heavier into the paper in those years. I traced a column with my finger. The yield per tree was higher here than anything we saw this past season. He looked where I was pointing. The trees were younger then. "That's the opposite of how it usually works," I said. He was quiet a beat. "I know." I wrote nothing in the margin that time. I only looked at the number, then at him, and understood that he'd already known something was wrong long before I'd put a name to it. I could tell by how still he'd gone, the particular stillness of a man recognizing something he'd spent years managing not to recognize. I turned the page. The entries from 2 years before the blight showed a drop, not catastrophic, but real, a number that could have belonged to a different orchard entirely from the one 3 years earlier. "Was there a dry summer?" I asked. "There was. Another one the year after." "Yes, and the blight came the year after that." He looked up at the barn rafters a long moment, then back down at the page. "I'm not saying the blight was avoidable," I told him. "I'm saying the trees were already tired before it ever showed up." He put his hand flat against the table itself, not against the ledger this time. I watched him do it and didn't look away. I closed my ledger not because I was finished. 3 seasons of entries still sat unread, but because there's a point past which reading stops being useful and starts being something else. And I'd reached it. I thought he had too. I set my pencil in the center of the closed cover. He didn't move right away. He stayed exactly where he was, one hand flat on the table, looking at the lamp instead of at me. I let him stay there. The light held between us, warm and without color, and neither one of us reached to put it out. We sat like that a few minutes longer. The lamp burned steady. The horses settled fully. Outside, the plains lay under a sky gone completely dark. No moon risen yet, just the flat weight of it pressing down on the grass, and the long rows I'd measured and measured again. He moved first, picked up the ledger and set it back on the shelf exactly where it had lived, spine out, between the harness inventory and an old water rights record, doing it without ceremony. The way a man sets a thing down when he's finally ready to stop carrying it himself. I blew out the second lamp. We walked out of the barn side by side, not touching, and stood a minute in the dark between the barn and the house. The air had shifted, carrying something cool off the grass now, the particular smell September gets right before it hands the season off to something colder. "The south row will need staking before the first frost," he said. "I know, I counted the stakes this morning, we have enough." That was all either of us said. I went inside. He stood out there another minute looking at the dark shape of the orchard. I watched him from the kitchen window, his back to me, not waiting for anything in particular. just standing in it the way a person stands inside a feeling they've finally stopped being afraid of. I put the kettle on. When he came in, he didn't say anything at first, hung his hat, sat at the table. I set a cup in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it and watched the steam come off it a while before drinking. I sat across from him with my own cup. The kitchen was quiet, the stove ticking down, and somebody's bootlace lay forgotten on the floor by the door. I made a mental note to return it come morning. "The yield next year," he started. "Better if the rain holds," I said. He nodded. I drank my coffee. "Now, before I tell you how the rest of that first month went, and what happened at the courthouse in Cutter's Bend once the 30 days were up, I want to ask you something. Because I've wondered about it ever since. If a letter like that one had landed on your windowsill, a stranger, a wage, a trial month, nothing promised but honesty, would you have written back the way I did? Or would you have folded it up and put it in a drawer and told yourself it was too big a risk for a woman with $40 and a sewing basket? I think about that more than I probably should. Later that night, when the cups were empty and the stove had gone low, I stood to carry them to the basin. He stood too, for no reason that needed naming out loud, and when I turned back around, he was close enough that I didn't step away from it. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, one slow motion, his thumb brushing my cheek at the end of it. Neither of us said a word. I turned back to the basin. He banked the stove for the night. We moved through the last small tasks of the evening in that same quiet room, the way two people do once the question between them has stopped being asterisk whether and become only asterisk when. And the when, by then, didn't frighten either one of us anymore. The lamp on the windowsill stayed burning past midnight that night, and I remember lying awake a while just watching the light of it move across the ceiling. Thinking about the 12 ledgers on that shelf, and the trees still standing out there marked in pale cloth, and how strange it was that the thing I'd come here to save turned out, somewhere along the way, to be saving me right back. 30 days came and went. We didn't need the whole month to know. But that part of the story, the courthouse, the boy who finally started calling me by name instead of ma'am, the first real harvest off that third row 2 autumns later, that's a story for another time if you want to hear it. So tell me, what would you have done, standing at that window with the letter in your hand? Would you have written back? Let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if this one found you the way it found me, stick around, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.